The snow had been falling for 2 days straight when Sallie Whitaker realized she was going to freeze to death before spring ever came to Harlan County, Wyoming. She stood at the frostbitten window of the small homestead her late husband Thomas had built with his own 2 hands in the summer of 1881, watching the white world beyond the glass consume everything she had ever known, and she counted what was left of her firewood stack with the practiced eye of a woman who had learned to measure survival in cord feet and ration it like gold dust. 11 logs, maybe 12, if she counted the split pieces near the door frame. 11 logs against a blizzard that showed no sign of mercy, no sign of stopping, no sign of caring one whit that a 26-year-old widow with a 4-year-old son named James and a failing cattle ranch had absolutely nowhere else to turn. Thomas Whitaker had died in October, thrown from his horse at the worst possible time, just before the hard work of laying in winter stores was finished, just before the woodpile had reached anything near a sufficient height. The men from town had come out twice to help good-hearted men who had their own families, their own problems, their own fires to keep burning. Reverend Aldous had sent his eldest boy out with a sack of flour and some smoked bacon. Mrs. Dalton at the general store had extended Sallie's credit with a quiet dignity that asked for no thanks. But firewood was heavy and scarce, and difficult to haul 12 miles through mountain terrain even in fair weather, and now the weather was anything but fair. Sallie pulled her wool shawl tighter around her shoulders and turned from the window to check on James, who was sleeping on the cot near the iron stove, his small face flushed and peaceful in the way that only children can manage when the adult world around them is collapsing under the weight of its own fear. She touched his forehead gently, warm but not feverish. Good. That was something. She would hold on to that. She fed 2 logs to the stove, watching the orange glow intensify behind the grate, telling herself that was enough for now, that she needed to be careful, that she could not afford the luxury of warmth the way she once could. She had enough coal oil for the lamp for perhaps 3 more days. She had enough food for a week if she stretched the portions. She had the cattle in the barn, 14 head of mixed Hereford and Longhorn stock that Thomas had been so proud of, and she had fed them that morning through a snowdrift that had come up past her knees, and she would do it again tomorrow if tomorrow came. But the firewood was the thing. The firewood was the thread on which everything else was hanging. Outside, Harlan County sat buried and silent. The nearest neighbor was the Briggs family, 4 miles east, and she knew without sending anyone to check that old Pete Briggs had his own troubles. The town of Millhaven was 12 miles south along a road that was no longer a road but a white field indistinguishable from the land around it. Sallie Whitaker was, in every practical sense, alone. She did not cry. She had cried in October when they brought Thomas home draped across his saddle, and she had cried at the funeral when the wind came off the ridge and shook the tent they had erected over the grave site, and she had cried 2 weeks later when she found his work gloves still tucked in the pocket of his hanging coat. But she was not a woman who cried often, and she was not a woman who gave up, and she sat down at the table where Thomas used to read his almanac and folded her hands and thought. She thought about Edwin Hartwell. The thought surprised her, as it often did when it came unbidden, the way certain thoughts do when you have been careful to keep them away from the front of your mind. Edwin Hartwell was Thomas's oldest friend, a rancher who ran a modest spread about 40 miles north in the Callaway Creek Basin, a quiet man with dark eyes and careful hands, and a voice like the low register of a church organ. He had come to the funeral. He had taken off his hat and held it against his chest in both hands and said almost nothing, which was how Edwin showed the things that went deepest in him. He had shaken her hand with both of his and told her that if she needed anything, anything at all, she was to send word and he would come. She had nodded and thanked him because that was what you did, because men said those things at funerals, because the world required certain formalities in the face of grief. She had not sent word. It had been 3 months and she had not sent word, because Thomas had been Edwin's friend and not hers, Not really. And because accepting that kind of help from a man who was not family felt complicated in ways she could not fully name. And because she was Sallie Whitaker, and she had been taking care of herself since she was 16 years old, and stubbornness was the only inheritance her father had left her that was worth anything. But she thought about Edwin Hartwell now, the way you think about a shore when the water is rising, the way you think about a lamp when the dark gets thick enough to touch. She pushed the thought aside and went to sleep in her clothes to stay warm. The next morning the blizzard was worse. Sallie woke to the sound of wind shrieking around the corners of the house like something alive and furious. And the stove had gone cold in the night because she had let herself sleep too long. And James was huddled against her with his little fists curled under his chin, still sleeping but shivering in small increments that broke something in her chest. She got up fast and fed the last 4 logs into the stove and got a fire going with trembling hands and shaking fingers. And when the heat finally began to radiate out from the iron, she sat back on her heels and faced the arithmetic of her situation with absolute clarity. She had 7 logs left. The storm showed no signs of stopping. She had a 4-year-old boy who was beginning to shiver in his sleep, and 7 logs between them and the kind of cold that was not negotiable. She made a decision. She bundled James in every piece of warm clothing she could find, wrapping him in her own second wool blanket until he looked like a small, round parcel with 2 bright eyes peeking out at her. She told him she was going to the barn to check on the cattle, and that he was to stay on the cot by the stove and not touch anything. He nodded with the serious expression of a child who understood more than his years should have permitted him to understand. Then she put on Thomas's heavy canvas coat over her own coat, pulled his hat down over her ears, wrapped a scarf 3 times around her face, and stepped out into the blizzard. The wind hit her like a physical thing, like a wall built out of cold and malice, and she grabbed the guide rope she had strung between the house and the barn in October when the first hard weather threatened, and she pulled herself hand over hand through the screaming white toward the barn door. The cattle were huddled together for warmth, miserable but alive. She distributed hay and broke the ice on the water trough with a hammer, and she checked each animal with the methodical efficiency of a woman who had been running this ranch alone for 3 months. And then she stood in the relative shelter of the barn and stared at the woodpile Thomas had started at the barn's side wall. There were logs there, not many, perhaps enough for the animals stored close for their warmth, not for the house. Sallie stood and looked at them and made the calculation and knew. She went back to the house. She sat at the table. She took the ink bottle and the pen from the drawer where Thomas had kept them alongside his ledger and his almanac, and she took a piece of paper and she wrote a letter to Edwin Hartwell. She wrote it plainly, the way she did everything. She told him the blizzard had caught her short. She told him the woodpile was nearly gone. She told him she did not know if this letter could even be sent, since the road to town was impassable, but she was writing it because she had been told to write when she needed help, and she was writing. She told him not to come if it was too dangerous. She told him she would manage. Then she crossed that last part out because she had made a decision to be honest, and she did not know if she would manage, and Edwin Hartwell of all people deserved honesty. She folded the letter and addressed it to the Callaway Creek Basin and set it on the table. Then she fed James a bowl of oatmeal thinned with water and told him a story about a bear who slept through winter, and she watched his face go bright with laughter at the right moments, and she thought about 40 miles of mountain country buried in a blizzard, and she told herself the letter was just something she had done, not something she expected anything from. She did not know, sitting at that table on the second day of the blizzard, that Edwin Hartwell was already thinking about her. He had been thinking about her for weeks, which was its own kind of torment for a man like Edwin, who did not easily give his thoughts over to anything he could not act on. He had ridden out to the Whitaker place twice since October, once with a quarter of elk he had taken early in the season, once with a coil of new rope when he heard from Pete Briggs that Sallie was managing the ranch alone and might be short on gear. Both times she had accepted the gifts with a quiet dignity that reminded him of someone carrying something very heavy and refusing to let anyone else take the weight. Both times he had ridden home with the feeling that he had said too little and done too little, and that the miles between his ranch and hers were too many. Edwin Hartwell was 31 years old, a man who had come west from Illinois at 22 with 2 horses and $100, and the specific kind of stubbornness that the territory seemed to draw out of young men who needed something large to push against. He had built the Callaway Creek Ranch from raw land, had cut timber and hauled stone and learned cattle and weather, and the particular rhythms of Wyoming and the way that the land teaches things, which is slowly and without sympathy. He was not a man who frightened easily. He was not a man who talked much about what was inside him. But he was a man who felt things with a depth that sometimes alarmed him, and what he felt about Sallie Whitaker had been alarming him since the summer of 1880, when he had come to Thomas's wedding and seen her standing in the churchyard in a yellow dress with her dark hair up, looking at the sky the way she sometimes looked at things when she thought no one was watching her, with this quality of stillness that he had never seen in any other person. He had shaken Thomas's hand and kissed Sallie's cheek, and ridden home feeling like a man who had missed a train by 30 seconds. He had told himself to leave it alone. He had left it alone for 2 years. And then Thomas had died in October, and Edwin had gone to the funeral and held his hat against his chest in both hands because it was the only way he could keep himself from reaching out to her, and he had told her to send word if she needed anything, and she had not sent word. On the 3rd morning of the blizzard, before any letter could have reached him, before he had any information beyond what his own instincts were telling him, Edwin Hartwell saddled his big gray horse Remington and loaded 3 days' worth of supplies onto his pack mule and rode south toward Harlan County. His foreman, a grizzled Arizona man named Clyde Oakes, stood in the barn doorway and watched him do it with the expression of a man watching someone do something that is either very brave or very foolish and is not sure which category applies. "That's 40 miles in a blizzard," Clyde said. "I know how far it is," Edwin said. "She send for you." "No." Clyde was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You want me to come?" "No, I need you here. Keep the stock alive." "Edwin." Clyde's voice had something in it that rarely surfaced in a man of his type, something almost gentle. "You know what you're riding into." "I know what I'm leaving behind if I don't," Edwin said, and he swung up onto Remington and rode out into the white. The blizzard hit him before he had cleared the first valley. The wind came sideways off the ridge and drove ice crystals into the exposed strip of skin between his scarf and his hat brim, and Remington dropped his head and leaned into it with the dogged determination of a horse who trusted his rider absolutely and had been through worse. The pack mule, a stolid bay animal named Dutch, followed on the lead rope without complaint. Edwin kept his eyes on the terrain ahead and navigated by landmarks he had ridden past 100 times: the split pine on the southern ridge, the creek crossing at the mouth of the Callaway Basin, the long downslope toward the Jenkins Pass. The first day the cold was manageable if he kept moving. He made camp that night in the lee of a granite outcropping, built a fire from wood he had packed himself, melted snow for water, ate jerked beef and hardtack without tasting any of it, and lay with his saddle blanket and Remington's warmth at his back and thought about Sallie. He thought about her the way he had learned to think about her, carefully, the way you handle something that might break, with both hands and full attention. He thought about her standing at that window he had glimpsed through the frost when he had ridden by 2 weeks ago, her profile sharp against the lamplight inside. He thought about the way she had shaken his hand at the funeral. He had held her hand in both of his, and he had felt the calluses on her palm from the work she was doing, and something in him had gone fierce and quiet at the same time, like a fire when you bank it for the night. He slept 3 hours and was back on the horse before the sun came up, though the sun never really came up through the storm. The second day was worse. The wind shifted north and came down off the high country with a ferocity that made the first day seem almost gentle. And the snow was deep enough now that Remington was lunging through drifts instead of walking, and Edwin had to dismount twice to break trail on foot, leading the horse through the worst sections, his boots soaking through despite the extra wrapping he had put around them, his hands so cold inside his gloves that they stopped aching and went to that numb stillness that was more alarming than pain. He fell once, going down a slope where the snow had hidden a drop in the terrain, and Remington nearly came down on top of him, and Edwin lay face down in the snow for 3 seconds staring at the white ground an inch from his nose, and then he got up and kept walking. He fell again near the old Parker homestead, the abandoned one that had been empty since '78 when the Parker family had given up on Wyoming and gone back east, and this time he lay there a moment longer and he thought, with a clarity that the cold had stripped him down to, about why he was doing this. Not the practical reason, not the firewood. He knew why he had loaded 3 cords worth of split wood on Dutch before he left, buying it from his own considerable pile, selecting the best seasoned oak and ash he had because those burned longest and hottest. He knew why he had not sent a hand instead, why he had not simply waited for the storm to break, and then arranged for a wagon to make the trip in better conditions. He knew, lying face down in Wyoming snow in the middle of a blizzard that had already run for 2 days and showed no sign of relenting, exactly what he was doing and why. He was going because she was there. Because she was alone with a small boy and a fire that was going cold, and because 40 miles and a blizzard and 3 days of the hardest riding he had ever done was still not far enough and not hard enough to count as a reason not to go, not when it was Sallie. Not when it had always been Sallie, in the quiet part of him that he kept banked and covered and carefully tended, the way you tend a fire you are not ready to let the world see yet. He got up and kept going. That night he made camp inside the old Parker homestead, having broken the door loose from 2 years of ice and wind damage with his shoulder, and he built a fire in the ruined hearth from wood he had packed, and he sat close to it, and examined his hands and feet for the early signs of frostbite with the calm assessment of a man who has been in cold country long enough to know what to look for. His toes on his left foot were numb longer than they should have been. He pulled off the boot and held his foot near the fire and worked the circulation back with his hands, and it hurt coming back, which was a good sign, because pain meant blood was still moving. He ate and slept and woke before dawn and saddled Remington again. The 3rd day the storm eased, as if it had said what it had to say and was now merely sulking instead of raging. The wind dropped to something survivable, and the snow that fell was lighter, finer, almost peaceful in comparison to what had come before. Edwin rode the last 12 miles in a kind of exhausted, purposeful silence, man and horse moving through the whitened world with the slow determination of something that cannot be stopped. He knew when he crossed onto Whitaker land. He had ridden it enough times to know the fence posts Thomas had put in, even buried as they were now under 3 feet of snow. He angled toward the barn first because that was the practical thing, the thing that needed doing, and he came around the rise and saw the homestead below him in the early gray light and saw smoke coming from the chimney, thin but present, and something in his chest unwound so fast and completely that he actually had to stop Remington for a moment and just breathe. She was alive. There was a fire. She was keeping it going. He rode down to the barn first and put Remington and Dutch inside, out of the weather, and he broke ice and found hay and saw to the animals with the thoroughness of a man who cannot rest until the creatures in his care are cared for. Then he went to the woodpile he had carried 40 miles through a 3-day blizzard. He unloaded it piece by piece from Dutch's pack and stacked it against the wall of the house under the overhang of the porch roof where it would stay dry, working in the gray pre-dawn quiet with the snow still falling soft around him, his breath coming in white clouds, his arms aching from 2 days of fighting the storm. He stacked it properly, the way you stack wood to last, the big pieces on the bottom and the split pieces on top, enough to carry her through January and into February if she was careful, enough to keep a stove burning and a small boy warm for weeks. He worked for an hour. He never knocked. That was the thing that would stay with him for years afterward, the thing he could not entirely explain even to himself when he tried. He stood on that porch with his knuckles raised, and he could hear her moving inside, the creak of a floorboard, the small sounds of a household beginning its morning, and he thought about what it would mean to knock. He thought about what she would see when she opened the door. A man on her porch in the gray dawn after a blizzard. A man who had ridden 3 days through impossible weather to bring her firewood. A man whose face would be showing things he was not ready to show, and that she was not perhaps ready to see, not 3 months after burying her husband, not with everything still so raw and so new and so much her own grief to carry. He thought about what he wanted. He wanted to see her face. He wanted to stand in the doorway and have her look at him, the way she sometimes looked at things when she thought no one was watching. But he also knew, with the part of him that had learned patience the hard way, that some things offered without expectation are worth more than things given with the intent of being seen. He wanted her warm. He wanted the wood to be there when she needed it. He did not need the credit. He did not need the thanks. He needed her to be alive and warm and able to look at her boy's face without the arithmetic of disaster running behind her eyes. He put his knuckles down. He stepped off the porch. He went back to the barn and wrapped himself in saddle blankets and slept in the hay next to Remington for 4 hours, because he was human, and the 3 days had taken everything he had, and he was not capable of the 40-mile return trip until he had rested. Sallie Whitaker opened her front door at 7 in the morning to let out the last smoke from a stovepipe that needed clearing, and she saw the firewood. She stood in the doorway in Thomas's canvas coat with her hair loose and her feet in wool socks, and she stared at the woodpile that had not been there the night before, and she felt something happen inside her that she was not entirely prepared for. It was a large woodpile. It was a thoughtfully stacked woodpile. It was not emergency scraps thrown against a wall. It was properly seasoned oak and ash, the good stuff, the kind that burned long and hot, stacked with the careful attention of someone who knew what they were doing and cared about doing it right. She stepped off the porch in her sock feet without thinking, because the snow on the porch boards was packed and she moved without registering it. And she walked to the woodpile and put her hand on the top piece of oak and stood there in the early morning cold with the snow still falling and something working its way through her chest that she did not have a name for. Not grief, though grief was still there, layered underneath everything else like stone under soil, something else. Something that felt like being held up from a direction you did not expect. Then she saw the tracks, horse tracks. A second set, smaller, a pack animal, coming from the north and going to the barn. She stood very still for a moment. Then she walked to the barn. She pulled the barn door open and the warm animal smell rolled out to meet her, and she saw 2 horses she did not recognize in the far stall, a big gray and a bay mule, and she saw the figure in the hay at the back of the stall wrapped in saddle blankets, and even before he stirred and turned his face toward the light she knew. She knew the way you know certain things that you have been not knowing for a while. "Edwin Hartwell," she said. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. He came awake fast, the way men who sleep in uncertain places come awake, and he sat up and looked at her with dark eyes that were still half in sleep, and his dark hair was pushed out of shape, and there was frost on the collar of his coat and 3 days of growth on his jaw, and he looked like a man who had been through considerable weather, which he had. "Morning," he said. His voice was the low register she had always known, the one that sounded like it came from somewhere deeper than a voice had any right to come from. She looked at him for a long moment. "You rode here?" "Yes." "In the blizzard?" "Yes." "You rode 40 miles in a blizzard to stack wood on my porch?" He held her gaze with the directness that had always been his way, not challenging, not apologetic, just present and quiet and entirely himself. "You needed wood," he said. She kept looking at him. "You did not knock." Something moved across his face, something careful and considered. "No." Why not? He was quiet for a moment, and she had the sense he was choosing the honest answer rather than the easier one. Because I did not want you to feel like you owed me anything, he said. And because I was not sure I trusted myself to stand on your porch in the early morning and say only what needed saying. The barn was warm and quiet around them. Outside, the snow was still coming down, soft now, nothing like the fury of the last 3 days. One of the Whitaker cattle lowed somewhere in the stall behind her, the ordinary sound of an animal waiting to be fed, and she was aware of how strange and also how completely natural it felt to be standing in her own barn at 7 in the morning talking to Edwin Hartwell like this, with the distance between his words and her understanding of them getting smaller with every exchange. "You should come inside," she said. "I will make coffee." He unfolded himself from the hay and stood, and she saw the stiffness in the way he moved, the evidence of what 3 days through a Wyoming blizzard costs a man, even a strong one, and she felt a sharp, specific tenderness that frightened her a little with its clarity. "I did not want to impose," he said. "Edwin," she said, and something in the way she said his name made them both go still for a second. "You rode 40 miles through a blizzard to bring me firewood. You are not imposing by accepting a cup of coffee." He almost smiled. It was a small thing, that almost smile, barely there, but she caught it, and it did something to the arithmetic inside her chest. They walked back to the house together through the soft falling snow. James was awake and sitting on the cot with his blanket wrapped around his shoulders, and his dark eyes enormous when Edwin ducked through the doorway behind his mother. The boy stared at Edwin with the frank assessment of a 4-year-old who has not yet learned to disguise his opinions. "That is a big man," James announced. "James," Sallie said. "It is fine," Edwin said, and he crouched down to James's level so that they were eye to eye, and Sallie watched something in James recalibrate from wariness to something approaching interest. "What is your name?" "James Thomas Whitaker," James said with the gravity of a child reciting something important. "That is a fine name," Edwin said. "My name is Edwin Hartwell. Your mama knows me." "Did you bring the wood?" James asked. "I did." "Good," James said, apparently satisfied. "Mama was worried about the wood." Edwin looked up at Sallie briefly, and she felt the color move in her face and turned to the stove to hide it. "Sit down," she said. "Both of you. I will get coffee going." Edwin sat at Thomas's table in Thomas's chair, and Sallie was conscious of this, in a way that she would not have expected to be. Not with bitterness or resentment, but with a complicated layering of emotions that she did not examine too closely, while she had coffee to make and a fire to tend, and a 4-year-old narrating his opinions about everything to a large, quiet man who listened to each one with complete and genuine attention. She listened to James talk, and she watched Edwin with the boy out of the corner of her eye as she moved around the small kitchen space. And she thought about what it cost a man to ride 40 miles through a 3-day blizzard and arrive before dawn, and stack a cord of firewood on someone's porch without knocking. And she thought about the particular kind of man that was. And she thought that she had been very careful for 3 months not to think certain thoughts. And perhaps she had been so careful that she had not allowed herself to think clearly at all. She set a cup of coffee in front of Edwin and one at her own place and sat down across the table from him, and he wrapped his hands around the cup with a gratitude that was entirely unperformed, the gratitude of a man who has been cold for 3 days and is now warm, the simple animal pleasure of heat against the palms. "You should not have come," she said. She said it without accusation, with a kind of wondering quality to her voice, as though she was still working out what she thought about the fact that he had. He looked at her over the cup. "Probably not," he said. "It was 3 days. Yes, you could have been killed, frostbite at minimum. You were riding blind in that weather. I know the country well enough." "Edwin." She said his name again and again. There was that quality in it, the quality she kept not intending, the quality of someone saying a word they have said only inside their head for a very long time and finding it sounds different out loud. "Why?" He set the cup down. He looked at her the way he had been looking at her, with the patience of a man who had been patient about a thing for 2 years and had finally decided to stop being quite so careful about it. "Because I thought of you standing in that house with the wood running out and the storm not stopping," he said, "and I could not think of much else after that." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the wind had dropped to almost nothing. James had climbed up onto the cot again and was occupied with a small carved wooden horse that Thomas had made for him before he died, making low sound effects that were evidently horse-related, entirely absorbed. The way small children are when they have decided a situation is safe and interesting in the right proportions. Sallie Whitaker looked at Edwin Hartwell across Thomas's table and felt, beneath the grief that was still genuinely hers and would be for some time, beneath the bewilderment and the tenderness and the complicated texture of everything the last 3 months had been, something that was simply true and simply present, the way the firewood was present on the porch outside, solid and real and placed there by a man who had known she needed it before she had asked. "I sent you a letter," she said. He blinked. "I did not receive a letter. I wrote it the day before yesterday. I could not send it. The road is gone. I wrote it anyway." She folded her hands on the table surface. "It said I needed help. Did it say anything else?" She looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," she said, "but the road was impassable, so you never received it, and I am not certain I am ready to say those things out loud yet." He nodded slowly, as if this was exactly the right answer, as if he had expected nothing more and was grateful for exactly what he had been given. "All right," he said, "but I am glad you came," she said. "I want you to know that." "That will do me for a while," he said, and he picked up his coffee cup again, and she could see in the set of his shoulders and the quiet of his face that he meant it completely, that he was a man who could hold a thing gently and wait for it to be ready, and that this was perhaps the most important thing she needed to know about him right now. He stayed for 2 days because the storm took one more run at them that afternoon, a shorter one, nothing like the 3-day blizzard but enough to close the road again, and there was nothing to do but wait. He slept in the barn. He came in for meals. He split the wood he had brought to lengths that would fit the stove more efficiently, working in the yard with the easy rhythm of a man who is accustomed to hard physical work and finds it satisfying in a quiet way. And Sallie watched him from the window sometimes with her coffee and thought that the house felt different with another adult in it, not in a way that erased Thomas, but in a way that reminded her that the world was still inhabited, that there was still life going on outside the small circle of her grief. James attached himself to Edwin with the uncomplicated directness of a small boy who has decided an adult is safe and interesting, following him around the yard and asking questions in the rapid-fire way of 4-year-olds everywhere, each question landing before the last one was fully answered, and Edwin fielded them all with a patience and a warmth that she had not known he had, or perhaps had not let herself see before. On the second evening, with the last of the storm passing, and the sky clearing to a hard, brilliant cold that meant tomorrow would be rideable, they sat at the table after James had fallen asleep, and they talked. Not about anything particular at first. About the winter, about the cattle, about the state of the road to Millhaven, about the ranch. She told him about the fence line on the east pasture that needed restringing in the spring, about the heifer she thought was going to calve early, about her plan to expand the hay meadow if she could get it done before next winter. She talked about the ranch the way she talked when she was not being careful, when she was simply thinking out loud, and Edwin listened and asked questions that showed he had been paying attention, and sometimes offered thoughts that were useful without being prescriptive, without the quality some men had of assuming a woman needed to be told what to do rather than having a useful conversation about a problem. At some point, they stopped talking about the ranch. "Do you get lonely out here?" he asked. Quiet and direct the way he asked things, she considered it honestly. "Yes," she said, "more than I expected. I thought I was good at being alone. I think I was before." She paused. "It is different now." "Yes," he said. "I miss having someone to talk to, James is wonderful, but he is 4 and the conversations have a particular range. She heard the small, rueful humor in her own voice and was surprised by it. That humor was still something she could access. Thomas used to sit where you are sitting and read his almanac aloud. He would read it and tell me things about weather and crop predictions in a tone that suggested he had personally written the almanac himself, and I used to find it maddening. She looked at the table surface. I would give a great deal to hear it one more time. Edwin was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He talked about you all the time, you know. When he would come up to Callaway Creek to look at my bulls in the spring, he would talk about the ranch and he would talk about you, and there was not much gap between the two in his mind, like they were the same thing." She felt the tightening in her chest that came with it and breathed through it the way she had learned. "I know he loved this place," she said. "He loved you more than the place," Edwin said. "He was not a man who talked much about feelings. You know that, but that came through clear enough." She looked at him across the table and found that she was not angry at him for saying it, which she had half expected to be, but rather that she was grateful in the specific way you are grateful when someone speaks plainly about a thing that matters. "He would want someone to look after you and James," Edwin said. He said it carefully, looking at her to see how it landed. "Perhaps," she said. "That is not why I am glad you came, though. I want to be clear about that." He held her gaze. "Then why?" She looked at him for a long time. "Because I have been alone inside my own head for 3 months, and you sat at this table tonight and talked to me like I was someone whose thoughts were worth hearing. And because you rode 40 miles through a blizzard in the dark to put wood on my porch, and then you did not knock. And I have been thinking about that since I found it this morning, and I keep arriving at the same answer when I think about why a man would do that." "What answer?" he said. His voice was very quiet. "That he cared more about whether I was warm than whether I knew he had done it," she said. The kitchen held that between them for a moment. "Sallie," he said, just her name. The way she had been saying his with that quality that came from having said it only inside for too long. "I know," she said. "I know, Edwin, I am not ready. I will not pretend I am ready when I am not, because you deserve more than pretending, but I want you to know that I see you. I see what you are, and I am not," she took a slow breath, "I am not indifferent." He looked at her with those dark, steady eyes and he said, "That is enough. That is more than enough. Take all the time you need." She believed him. That was the thing. She looked at him and she believed, completely and without reservation, that he meant every word of it, and that he would give her exactly as much time as she needed and not push for a single moment more. And that this quality in him, the quality of a man who could want something and wait for it without the waiting poisoning his wanting, was perhaps rarer than firewood in a blizzard, which was saying something. He left the next morning, riding north in the clean cold light of a sky that had finally cleared to that winter blue that Wyoming does better than anywhere else in the world. And she stood on the porch and watched him go, and James stood beside her with his little hand in hers, and they watched until the gray horse and the bay mule disappeared over the ridge. "Is he coming back?" James asked. She looked down at her son, at his father's dark eyes in his small round face. "I believe he might," she said. The spring came slowly, as springs do in Wyoming, not arriving so much as negotiating its way in past the winter's defenses in small daily increments. A little more light here, a little less ice there, mud where there had been hard ground, and the world coming back to itself with the unhurried patience of something that has done this many times before and is in no rush. Sallie threw herself into the work of the ranch with the whole energy of a woman who had come through something and emerged on the other side of it still standing, still capable, still herself. The cattle came through the winter better than she had dared hope. The heifer calved early, as predicted, producing a fine bull calf that James immediately named General, and that Sallie did not have the heart to point out would not be keeping that name past the fall. She hired a hand for the spring work, a young man named Arthur Cole, who was the youngest son of a Millhaven family with more sons than land and who was capable and willing, and not inclined to treat her as anything other than his employer, which she appreciated without reservation. Edwin came in April. He came on a Thursday, riding down from the north in the early afternoon light with his hat pushed back, and his horse moving at the easy walk of a man who is not in a hurry because he is arriving somewhere he wants to be. And Sallie was in the yard working on the east fence when she saw him come over the ridge. She felt the thing in her chest that she had started to recognize, the specific internal event that happened when Edwin Hartwell appeared in the range of her vision, and she pushed her hair back under her hat and went to meet him at the fence line. Swung down from Remington, and they stood on either side of the fence, and he looked at her with the directness she had come to count on, and he said, "You look well." "I am well," she said. "The heifer had her calf. The east fence needs a section replaced. The hay meadow is going to be a project. You look like you survived the winter." "It was a tolerable winter," he said. He looked at the fence section she had been working on. "You want a hand with that?" "I was managing," she said. "I know you were managing." "I am asking if you want a hand." He said it without any quality of challenge, purely as an offer, the way he made all his offers. She considered him for a moment, this big quiet man who had ridden 3 days through a blizzard and never knocked. "Yes," she said. "All right." They worked on the fence until evening, and James ran back and forth between the yard and the fence line and Edwin's horse, who tolerated the attention with a patience that James repaid by offering handfuls of grass and fragments of a biscuit he had been carrying in his pocket. And Arthur Cole ate dinner with them because Sallie always fed her hand. And it was the most ordinary evening, and also one of the finest evenings she could remember in quite some time. After James was asleep and Arthur had gone to his bunk in the barn, she and Edwin sat on the porch steps in the cool spring night with the sky going from purple to black above them and the first stars coming out over the ridge. "I have been thinking," she said. "About what?" "About last winter, about the blizzard, about the firewood." She looked at the sky. "I have been thinking about it a great deal, actually, which I tried not to read too much into and eventually gave up trying not to and decided to simply accept what it means." He was very still beside her. "And what does it mean?" She turned to look at him. In the early dark she could see his face, the careful patience of it, the quality she had been thinking about since January, the quality of a man who can hold a thing gently and wait. "It means I would like you to come more often," she said. "If you are willing, I would like to see what this is when there is not a blizzard and a crisis and everything so tangled up with grief and fear. I would like to see what we are when things are ordinary." He looked at her with those dark eyes. "I can do ordinary," he said. "I am very good at ordinary." She laughed, which surprised her, a real laugh, the warm, immediate kind that comes from the belly and not from politeness. "I believe you," she said. He smiled, a real smile this time, not the almost smile of January but the full version, and she had not seen that before, and she decided she would like to see it considerably more. He came every 2 weeks through April, every week in May. By June he was coming twice a week and staying for Sunday dinners that started as practical meals and became something considerably more invested in their planning and their execution as the summer warmed up, and the reasons he came stopped needing to be practical ones. He helped her with the ranch, and she helped him with nothing because he had Clyde and his hands for that. But she was interested in his operation, and she asked good questions, and he answered them fully because he had the experience of a man who has managed land in Wyoming for 9 years, and she had the instincts of a woman who had been running her own place for 3 months under difficult conditions and learning fast. They talked about cattle and weather and the politics of the territory, which was pressing toward statehood with the earnest enthusiasm of something that has been waiting too long. They talked about James, who was growing at the alarming rate of small children, and who had decided that Edwin Hartwell was the most interesting person in his world, a judgment he delivered with the authority of a 4-year-old who has considered all available options and made his choice. They talked about less practical things too, about what she had been like growing up in Missouri before her family moved west, about what drove him out of Illinois at 22 with 2 horses and $100. About books, because it turned out that Edwin read, a fact that startled her and then stopped startling her because it fit, It was exactly the kind of thing a man like Edwin would do quietly, and without making anything of it. And he had opinions about what he read that were specific and considered and occasionally wrong in ways that led to conversations that went on past the time when they should both have been doing other things. She kissed him on a Thursday evening in late June. She had not planned it. He had come for dinner, and they had eaten, and James had fallen asleep in his chair at the table, which was a new habit that she suspected was connected to his strategy for staying up as late as possible while appearing accidentally asleep. And Edwin had carried the boy to his cot without being asked, the way he did certain things, noticing what needed doing and doing it without announcement. And when he came back to the kitchen, she was washing the dinner plates, and he came to stand beside her to take them and dry them, which was also something he had started doing without announcement. And she had turned to hand him the next plate and found him closer than she expected and simply, without planning it at all, kissed him. It was brief. She pulled back before he had quite registered what was happening and looked at him with what she suspected was an entirely undignified expression and said, "I apologize, that was not planned." He looked at her absolutely still with an expression she could not entirely read, and then he said, "Do not apologize." "I should not have, Sally," he said very quietly. "Please do not apologize for that." She looked at him. He looked back at her. The wet plate was still in her hand, and the evening light was coming through the window at the angle it took in late June, and it lit the side of his face and caught the dark of his eyes, and she thought, with the sudden clarity of someone who has been paying very close attention for a very long time, that she was in love with this man. Not newly, not recently. Perhaps not since January even. Perhaps longer than that, in the underground way that things grow before you see them. "Edwin," she said. "Yes. I believe I would like to do that again, and with somewhat more intention this time, if that is all right with you." "Sallie Whitaker," he said, and his voice had something in it she had never heard there before, something warm and undone. "That is the most all right thing anyone has ever said to me." She kissed him again, with intention, and it was quite different from the first one, warm and unhurried and thorough. The kiss of two people who have been patient about a thing for a very long time and are finally, doing the thing they have been patient about. And when she drew back the second time, she was breathless in a way she had not been breathless in a very long time, and Edwin was looking at her with an expression that she thought she would be happy to see on his face for the rest of her life. He proposed to her in September, in the East Meadow, where she had finally got the fence repaired and the hay harvested, which she was very proud of, and which Edwin had been present for a significant portion of because he had conveniently been around for most of the summer. He did it without a speech, which was right for him, which was exactly how she would have expected it, going down on one knee in the meadow grass with the aspens on the ridge gone yellow behind him, and looking up at her with those dark, steady eyes. "Sally," he said, "I am not good at speeches. I want to marry you, and I want to be here for you and James, and I want to be part of this place, and I want to do all of that with you for as long as we both live, and I thought you ought to know." She looked down at him. "Is that the proposal?" "That is the proposal." She considered him for a moment. He was down on one knee in a hay meadow in September, looking up at her like she was the fixed point his compass pointed to. And she thought about January, about the blizzard, about the wood on the porch and the boot prints in the snow and the figure in the hay in her barn with frost on his collar and dark eyes coming awake. She thought about everything between then and now, all the ordinary evenings, all the conversations, all the ways she had learned him and found each new thing she learned only made her want to know more. "Edwin Hartwell," she said. "Yes." He got to his feet and she thought he was going to say something else, but he did not. He simply put his hands on either side of her face with the careful precision he did everything with and kissed her forehead, and then her cheek, and then her mouth, and she put her hands on his chest and felt his heart going fast under his ribs, which she found endlessly satisfying. They were married in Millhaven in October, at the church where Thomas Whitaker had been buried a year before, because Sallie chose that church deliberately and with thought, because she was not a woman who ran from things, and because she wanted Edwin to know from the beginning that her past and her present were both going to be honored under the same roof of their shared life. Reverend Aldous performed the ceremony with a warmth and a sincerity that was entirely genuine, because he had watched Sallie Whitaker survive a year that would have broken many people, and he was glad to see her standing at the front of his church in a blue dress with her dark hair up, and a quiet brightness in her face that had not been there in October of the previous year. James was the ring bearer, a role he took with immense seriousness, walking the length of the church aisle with the concentration of a child navigating a significant responsibility, which he was, and delivering the ring to Edwin with the precision of a small person who had been practicing this specific task for 2 weeks. Clyde Oakes stood up with Edwin and cried, which he would have denied under any interrogation, and Mrs. Dalton from the general store sat in the third pew and smiled the way you smile when a thing has worked out as things should and you knew it would. They went back to the Whitaker place after the ceremony, which was now also the Hartwell place, because Edwin had sold his Callaway Creek operation to a family coming up from Colorado who needed land and paid a fair price, and had moved himself and Clyde and Dutch the mule south in August to begin the work of combining 2 ranches into one, which was considerable work, done with the efficiency of people who are motivated by something beyond practicality. The Hartwell Ranch, as it came to be known in Harlan County, grew. Edwin had capital from the Callaway Creek sale, and Sallie had the land and the cattle and the complete operational knowledge of how to run a Harlan County ranch in all conditions, including the most extreme. And between them, they built something that was better than either enterprise had been separately, which was not a surprise to either of them because they had always worked that way, each one filling what the other lacked, the way good partnerships do. They expanded the hay meadow and improved the barn and added 20 head of cattle to the herd and built a proper bunkhouse for Clyde and Arthur Cole, who both stayed on and who developed a working relationship characterized by a significant mutual grumpiness that was entirely performative and covered a genuine professional respect. The winter of 1883 came with considerably more ceremony than anyone in Harlan County would have preferred, but the woodpile on the Hartwell porch was stacked high, and the stove was properly maintained, and the house was warm. And on a January night with snow coming down soft outside the window, Edwin sat at the kitchen table reading aloud from his almanac in a voice that carried warmth and a certain quality of gentle absurdity. Reading Sallie the crop predictions for the following season with the same tone her first husband had used, and she sat across from him with her coffee and watched his face and felt so many things at once that she could not have named them all, but happiness was the largest of them, happiness and love and the specific complicated gratitude of someone who has been through the dark and arrived in the warm. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, stopping him mid-sentence about projected rainfall in the Powder River Basin. "I am going to have a baby," she said. He looked at her. His hand turned under hers and held it. The almanac stayed open to the Wyoming chapter, which seemed appropriate. "When?" he said. His voice was that particular low quiet that meant he was feeling something very deeply. "August, I think, maybe the end of July." She watched his face. "Edwin, I am here," he said. He turned her hand over in his and held it properly, his thumb tracing the work-roughened edge of her palm, with the gentleness of a man who has always had careful hands. "I am right here." She could see on his face what she had felt in her own chest when she had understood what was happening, the enormous overwhelming quality of a joy so large it is almost frightening, almost too much to contain, the kind that makes you grip tighter because you do not want to let go of anything that is this good. "James is going to be beside himself," she said. Edwin laughed. It was the full version, warm and unguarded, the laugh she had spent the last year learning all the variations of and still finding new ones. "He is going to tell the cattle," he said. "He tells the cattle everything." "He does," she agreed. "I think General understands more than we give him credit for." General understands that James Whitaker Hartwell will bring him half a biscuit every morning, and that is sufficient understanding for a steer. James had taken Edwin's name after the wedding, at his own request, delivered with 4-year-old solemnity at the breakfast table one morning in November. "I want to be a Hartwell too," he had said, the same way he decided things, completely and without ambiguity. Edwin had looked at Sallie over James's head, and she had seen in his face the kind of feeling that does not translate into words, and he had looked back down at the boy and said, "I would be honored, James," which was exactly the right thing. In July of 1883, on a hot Wednesday afternoon with the kind of sky Wyoming makes in high summer, all width and altitude, and a blue so clean it hurts to look at, Sallie gave birth to a boy. She had wanted Edwin in the house, and he had stayed, which was not strictly conventional but which she had insisted on with a firmness that left the subject closed. And he had stayed in the main room while the midwife, Mrs. Hartley from Millhaven, who was capable and calm and had been doing this work for 20 years, attended Sallie in the bedroom. And James sat next to Edwin on the bench by the door with enormous eyes and Edwin's hand over his, because the boy was 5 now and old enough to understand that something important was happening and to feel the waiting quality of it. When Mrs. Hartley opened the door and said, "Healthy boy, strong lungs," and Edwin could hear the strong lungs from where he was sitting, James said, "Can I come in? Can I?" And Edwin said, "Let's ask Mama," and they went in together, James first in the way Edwin had learned to arrange things. Sallie was sitting up in the bed with her hair loose and her face flushed, and the expression of a woman who has just done something extremely difficult and is feeling the extraordinary particular pride of having done it. And she was holding a very small and very indignant-looking person who had the dark hair that appeared to be a feature of everything produced by the combination of Sallie Whitaker and Wyoming. James climbed up beside her with the careful deliberateness of a child who has been told to be gentle and is applying this instruction with great concentration. He looked at the baby for a long moment. The baby, apparently feeling the scrutiny, opened its eyes. "He is small," James announced. "He was inside me for a long time," Sallie said. "He will get bigger. What is his name?" Sallie looked up at Edwin, who was standing at the bedside with his hat in his hands and his whole face doing the thing she loved, the thing where he felt something so large and so completely that it showed everywhere even though he was trying to be composed. "Edwin," she said. He cleared his throat. "Whatever you would like," he said. His voice was not entirely steady. "I thought Henry," she said. "Henry Thomas Hartwell." Something moved across Edwin's face at the middle name, something that recognized what she was offering, the continuing of the thread, the honoring of what had come before without letting it cast shadow on what was now. He looked at her with those dark eyes, and she could read in them everything she needed to know. "Henry," he said. "That is a good name." He sat on the edge of the bed beside her, and she leaned into him, and James pressed close to her other side. And the baby, Henry Thomas Hartwell, exercised his strong lungs for another moment, and then subsided into the sleep of the newly arrived. And the 4 of them sat in the warm July afternoon in the bedroom of the house that Thomas Whitaker had built, and that Sallie had kept through a blizzard and a year of grief, and that was now full. Full in the way that houses are full when they contain what they are supposed to contain. "You know," Sallie said quietly, "I wrote you that letter in January of last year and you never received it." He looked down at her. "I know. It said other things. Besides about the wood. Did it? It said I thought you were a good man. It said that I had been trying not to notice that for some time because it seemed complicated and because I was not ready to notice it. It said that sitting in the house with the fire going cold I found myself thinking about you, and it surprised me enough that I felt I ought to put it in writing." He was quiet for a moment. "A blizzard ate your letter," he said. "A blizzard ate my letter," she agreed. "But you came anyway." "I was always going to come," he said, "blizzard or not." She looked at him with the complete clear vision she had of him now, the vision that came from a year and more of learning someone daily in the particular intimacy of shared work and shared meals and shared winter nights and shared joy, the knowledge that runs too deep for uncertainty. "I know," she said. "I know you were." Henry stirred and made a small sound, and Sallie adjusted her hold and the baby settled again. And outside the window the July sky stretched wide and clean and permanent above the Wyoming ridgeline. And somewhere in the yard below she could hear Arthur Cole and Clyde arguing about something to do with a gate, the comfortable ongoing friction of men who have established their professional relationship and are comfortable within it. And it was ordinary and it was full and it was hers. The years that followed had the quality of things built well, solidly and without drama, accumulating the good weight of a life lived with intention and care. The ranch grew and prospered in the measured way that Wyoming ranches prospered, not in sudden leaps, but in gradual, reliable increments that meant something because they had been earned against real resistance, against weather and distance, and the particular difficulties of managing cattle on mountain terrain in a territory where the margin for error was narrow and unforgiving. Edwin turned out to be a man of surprising capacities that Sallie discovered at intervals over the years, which she found one of the finer pleasures of the arrangement. He could mend nearly anything made of wood or leather. He knew more about horse medicine than most veterinarians. He had a memory for stories, not the telling of them exactly. He was not a storyteller in the performing sense, but in the way of a man who has been listening to the world for a long time and retains what it tells him. And on winter evenings when the snow was coming down outside and the fire was good and James was doing his lessons at the table and Henry was asleep, Edwin would sometimes talk about the things he had seen and learned in the years before he was hers. And she would listen and find something new in him every time. James grew with the specific acceleration of a boy who is loved and has work to do and land to learn, becoming useful around the ranch before he was 8 in ways that Edwin supervised with the patience of a man who understood that competence had to be built slowly to be built properly. James had his father Thomas's gravity and his mother Sallie's stubbornness, and something that was entirely his own, a particular quality of watchful intelligence that saw patterns in things and drew conclusions from them before the adults around him had finished gathering the data. By the time he was 10, he was the most reliable fence inspector on the property, and Edwin trusted his eye completely, which James understood and which meant more to him than Edwin perhaps knew. Henry was a different creature entirely, smaller boned than James but quick-moving and loud, with opinions about everything from the age of 2 onward, and a laugh that came out of him at unexpected moments, with the force of something much larger than a child. A laugh that made everyone nearby laugh too, whether they meant to or not, which Henry had discovered early and deployed with the strategic awareness of someone who had recognized a useful tool. He adored his brother with a completeness that James reciprocated in the quieter way of older children, and the two of them together were capable of impressive cooperation when they wanted something and equally impressive combined argument when they disagreed with an adult position, which Sallie managed with the firm clarity that had always been her primary mode. In the spring of 1885, when Henry was nearly 2 and James was 7, Sallie told Edwin she was expecting again, and Edwin, who had learned in the intervening years to receive this kind of news with something approaching equanimity, simply set down the harness he had been mending and looked at her across the barn with a warmth and a particular private happiness that she could read as clearly as text. "When?" he said, the same as the first time. "Winter," she said. "Around Christmas." "That will keep things interesting," he said. "Our lives are never short of interesting," she said. "No," he agreed, "they are not." Their daughter was born on the 23rd of December in 1885, arriving as if she had consulted a calendar and chosen her timing for maximum effect. And she had her mother's dark hair and her father's dark eyes, and from the first hours of her life, displayed the firm intention of being herself that characterized the Hartwell household generally. They named her Clara, and James, now 7 and very senior in his own estimation, announced that he would be responsible for her protection, a commitment he honored for the rest of his life with the unsentimental thoroughness that was very much his own. The Christmas of 1885 was the loudest and fullest the Hartwell household had yet produced, with James directing proceedings with considerable authority and Henry contributing enthusiasm, at a volume that no one had asked for, but that added a quality to the celebrations that was impossible to imagine being without. And Edwin sitting at Thomas's table with the almanac open in front of him and Sallie beside him with Clara in her arms, and the lamp burning warm gold over all of it. He read the crop predictions in a tone that suggested he had personally written the almanac himself. She let him read for a while, and then she put her hand on his arm to stop him, and he stopped, and he looked at her with the eyes she had known for 3 years now, the eyes she had been learning since a blizzard January and had not finished learning and did not think she ever would. "Edwin," she said, "Sallie, I love you." She said it plainly, in the direct way she did everything, looking straight at him without flinching, the way she had been looking straight at things her whole life even when they were hard to look at. "I know I do not say it as often as I perhaps should. I want to say it clearly now. I love you the way this whole year has been. Completely." He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see in his face the same thing she had seen on the day he came in from the blizzard, the same thing he had felt that morning when he stacked wood on her porch without knocking, the patience and the depth and the wide, specific, particular love of a man who chose a thing with his whole self and meant it every day going forward. "Sallie Hartwell," he said, "I have loved you since before I had any right to." She leaned her head against his shoulder, careful not to disturb Clara, and he put his arm around her. And outside the snow was falling in the soft way it fell when it was not angry, just present. And the stove was warm and the woodpile outside the door was stacked high and properly seasoned under the porch overhang. And the lamp burned on the table over the open almanac, and the house was full. There were years ahead, good ones, the kind that accumulate without announcing themselves as remarkable, because they are built from the ordinary materials of a life well chosen, morning coffee and evening meals, and the work of seasons, and the arguments that get resolved, and the laughter that comes at unexpected moments, and the sleep of 2 people, beside each other in a room where the fire is properly banked. There were years of watching James grow into a man with his father Thomas's gravity, and his stepfather Edwin's patience, and his mother's stubborn, bright intelligence. Years of Henry's enormous laugh filling rooms that were not big enough to contain it. Years of Clara, who turned out to have opinions about everything, and the absolute conviction to act on each one, which her mother recognized and her father found simultaneously alarming and magnificent. There were ordinary mornings and ordinary troubles, the kind that arrive in every life. A hard winter here, a difficult season there, a fence that needed more work than expected, and a calf that did not make it, and the specific grief of loving animals in a place where the margin is not wide. Clyde Oakes worked on the ranch until he was too old to work, and then he lived in the bunkhouse and advised, loudly, on everything. And Edwin listened to him with the attentiveness that Clyde had earned through years of showing up. Arthur Cole married a Millhaven girl named Frances, and they built a small house on the east edge of the property that Edwin had offered him because good hands were worth keeping. And Frances and Sallie became the kind of friends who are forged by proximity and shared work, and the particular female solidarity of managing complicated men and unpredictable weather. Wyoming achieved statehood in 1890, which Millhaven celebrated with a degree of enthusiasm that the town council had not perhaps fully anticipated, and which resulted in a certain amount of disorder that everyone agreed afterward was entirely appropriate to the occasion. Edwin took Sallie and all 3 children to the celebration, and James, who was 12 by then, Read the Declaration of Statehood from the notice board in the town square, with the focused attention of a boy who already knew that he cared about the way things were governed, and would do something about it when he was old enough. The 4th of July in that same summer, the summer of Wyoming statehood, Edwin and Sallie stood on the porch of the house in the evening after the children were in bed, watching the valley below them in the long light that comes in July when the sky holds color past 9 o'clock, the grass green from the summer rain, and the cattle moving slow and dark across the lower pasture, and the whole landscape carrying the particular richness of a place that has been well tended. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him with the ease of complete familiarity, the ease of two people who have become the landscape of each other's daily life. She looked at the woodpile under the porch overhang, stacked high for the coming winter, the good seasoned oak and ash she had learned to distinguish by smell and by weight, the firewood that was always now something more than firewood in her private accounting of her own life. "You know what I was thinking about today," she said. "Tell me." "January of 1882, she said. "The blizzard. I woke up in the morning and went to the door, and there was that woodpile, and I could not figure out for a moment where it had come from. It seemed impossible, and then I saw the tracks." He was quiet, his arm steady around her shoulders. "I thought afterward," she said, "that I could not imagine doing what you did, riding 3 days in weather like that alone, and I thought, what kind of man does that?" She paused. "Now I know. You are that kind of man, every day." He looked at her, and she could see in his face the thing she had always been able to see in his face, the thing that had been there from the beginning, steady and unfashionable and entirely his own, the particular love of a man who chose a woman the way he chose everything, with his whole attention and without reservation, and who had been choosing her every day since a winter blizzard in 1882, and who would go on choosing her without drama or declaration, because that was simply what he was. "You chose this," he said, meaning the land and the life and all of it, meaning that she had done equal work to arrive at where they were. "We chose it," she said. He pressed his lips to her hair, and they stood together on the porch in the evening light of a Wyoming summer in the summer of 1890, and the land stretched out ahead of them warm and green and theirs, and the house behind them was full of the sleeping weight of 3 children and a life built properly, and everything that had been broken was healed, and everything that had been insufficient was made enough. And the woodpile stood high and well stacked under the overhang of the roof, where it would stay dry through whatever weather was coming, as it had every winter since a big gray horse and a bay mule had arrived in the pre-dawn dark of a blizzard morning, and a man had done what needed doing, and asked nothing in return. That had been the beginning of everything. She had known it since she saw the tracks in the snow. She knew it still, standing in the summer evening with his arm around her, and the valley spread below them like something given freely, like something that was simply, completely, and permanently theirs. The stars came out over the Wyoming ridge one by one as the last light faded, and the house behind them was warm and full, and there was absolutely nothing left that needed to be said.